The August sun in 1970 was a merciless hammer, beating down on the flat, black earth of Logan County. It baked the moisture from the soybean leaves, turning the air into a shimmering, dusty haze that smelled of diesel exhaust and parched soil. For Samuel Miller, the heat was just another part of the job. He sat perched on the iron seat of his 1958 Massey Harris 90 Special Combine, the engine's steady, throaty rumble a familiar comfort against his back. The faded red paint on the machine was peeling, showing patches of grey primer and the occasional bloom of orange rust, like battle scars earned over a dozen hard-fought harvests. He eased the clutch out, the old combine lurching forward in the long line for the grain elevator. The line was the county's social club this time of year, a slow-moving parade of iron dinosaurs and newborn giants. It was where you heard the gossip, gauged the yields, and took the measure of your neighbors. Sam wiped a forearm across his sweat-soaked brow, his chambray shirt sticking to his skin. He'd been up since 4, turning wrenches on the Massey's unloading auger, tightening a belt that had started to squeal. But she was running, and that's what mattered. She was his. Every nut, every bolt, every grease-stained bearing was paid for in cash and sweat, not banknotes and interest. A different kind of sound cut through the low thrum of the idling tractors and combines. It was a high, clean hum, the sound of modern efficiency, a brand-new John Deere 7700, so green it hurt the eyes, pulled up alongside Sam's Massey. The cab was a glass bubble, sealed against the dust and heat. And inside, sitting in what looked like a cushioned throne, was Richard Peterson. Rich was 10 years younger than Sam, with a soft face that hadn't yet been hardened by the sun, and a belief that progress was measured in horsepower and monthly payments. Rich killed the diesel, and the sudden quiet was jarring. He slid his window open, and a blast of cold, conditioned air washed over Sam, carrying the faint, sterile scent of a new vehicle. "Still fighting with that old relic, Sam?" Rich called out, a smirk playing on his lips. He didn't have to raise his voice. His new Deere purred where Sam's Massey chugged and grumbled. Sam squinted, leaning on the grain header control lever. "She ain't fighting me, Rich. We got an understanding." A few other farmers in the line, waiting in their own rigs, turned to watch. This was better than the radio. "An understanding?" Rich laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Looks to me like she's understood to break down every other round. I saw you stopped out on the north, 40 yesterday. Looked like a yard sale of tools spread out on the ground." "Had to adjust the cylinder speed," Sam said evenly, refusing to take the bait. "Beans are a little damp." "Cylinder speed," Rich scoffed, shaking his head, as if pitying a fool. He patted the gleaming green fender of his 7700. "I got a dial for that in here. Don't even have to leave the cab. Got a radio, too, and air that doesn't feel like it's coming out of a blast furnace." He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone, loud enough for the others to hear. "Sam, the bank down in town would be happy to set you up. A man can't get ahead with museum pieces. It's 1970. You got to get big or get out. That's what the man from the university said." Sam's hands tightened on the worn steel levers. He knew the speech. He'd heard it from the loan officers, the equipment dealers, the extension agents. It was a gospel of debt, a promise of an easier life financed at 7%. He looked at his own machine. He'd bought it used 6 years ago, paid for it with 2 good years of corn. He'd torn the Hercules engine down to the block himself that first winter, replacing the rings and bearings in his unheated workshop, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He knew the growl of the gearbox, the particular squeak of the straw walkers, the exact tension the main separator belt needed to run true. It was a part of him. this museum piece," Sam said, his voice low and steady. "Puts grain in the bin and doesn't send a bill to the house every month. When I turn the key off in November, she's mine. When you turn that key off, Rich, she still belongs to the First National Bank." Rich just laughed again, louder this time. "You can't eat pride, Sam. While you're out there with a grease gun and a wrench, I'm cutting twice the acres. I'll have my loan paid off in 5 years and be trading up again. You'll still be here, covered in grease, trying to coax one more season out of that thing." The line lurched forward. Rich sealed himself back inside his climate-controlled bubble, the powerful John Deere engine roaring to life with a clean, effortless surge. Sam engaged his own clutch, and the Massey shuddered ahead, the chain drives rattling, the old Hercules engine letting out a puff of blue smoke. The other farmers looked away, some with sympathy, most with the same pitying amusement as Rich. Sam was a relic, just like his combine, a stubborn fool clinging to the past while the future was rolling by on shiny new tires. He spent the rest of the day cutting the last of his soybeans, the sun dipping low and painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The Massey ran well, its familiar rhythms a conversation only he could understand. The clatter of the sickle bar, the whir of the reel, the steady hum of the cylinder separating bean from pod. It was honest work. But Rich's words echoed in his head, mixing with the mechanical symphony. Was he a fool? Was he letting his pride, his fear of debt, hold him and his family back? His wife Mary always supported him, but he saw the worry in her eyes when she looked at the ledger. Their son, David, was only 12, but he was already fascinated by the big new tractors he saw at the dealership. That night, sitting at the kitchen table long after Mary and David had gone to bed, Sam looked at the pile of bills and the single sheet from the co-op, showing his yield and the price per bushel. It was a good year. Not a great one, but a good one. Enough to pay his property taxes, buy seed and fertilizer for next spring, and put a little aside. There wouldn't be a new pickup truck. There wouldn't be a vacation. There would just be the quiet satisfaction of ending the year in the black. He thought of Rich's gleaming combine, of the acres it could swallow in an hour, of the easy comfort of its cab. The temptation was a physical thing, a knot in his gut. Now, before we get too deep into this story, I have to ask you folks listening, have you ever had to choose between taking on a big debt for something new and shiny, or sticking with the old reliable thing that's already paid for? It could be a car, a house, a piece of equipment. It's a heavy decision, one that weighs a man down. Let me know down in the comments what you would have done in Sam's shoes back there in 1970. Would you have gone to the bank like Rich, or would you have stuck it out with the old iron? The following harvest, the Massey started making a noise Sam didn't like. It was a high-pitched, intermittent squeal coming from deep within the machine's guts, a sound like tortured metal. It only happened under a heavy load, when the cylinder was full of tough soybean straw. He'd stop, shut everything down, and climb all over the combine, his hand hovering over bearings, trying to feel for excessive heat. He checked the grease fittings, pumping fresh lubricant into every joint until it oozed out, clean and new. But the noise always came back. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The corn was dry, shelling perfectly. He was on the last 10 acres of his best field, the one that bordered Rich Peterson's property. Across the fence, Rich was already done, his fields a neat carpet of chopped stalks. His land was disked, chiseled, and ready for winter. Sam was behind, as usual. The squeal started again, louder this time, more insistent. Then it became a grinding roar, a sound that vibrated through the steel frame of the combine and up into the soles of Sam's boots. He slammed the variable speed lever back and killed the engine in one practiced motion. Silence descended, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the rustle of the dry corn stalks in the breeze. He knew, with the sinking certainty of a man who knows his machinery, that this wasn't a simple fix. This was major. He spent the rest of the afternoon taking the main shield off the side of the combine, a huge, heavy piece of sheet metal held on by 24 bolts. By the time he had it off, his knuckles were skinned and his shirt was black with a mixture of grease and chaff. The problem was clear. The main cylinder bearing on the left side, a massive cast-iron housing containing a set of heavy-duty tapered roller bearings, was shot. The housing itself was glowing with heat, and a thin trickle of molten grease ran down the side of the separator housing. He sat back on his heels, the dust of the field settling around him, and stared at the damage. This wasn't a roadside repair. That bearing was pressed into a housing that was bolted deep inside the machine. To get it out, he'd have to pull the cylinder drive belts, unbolt the housing, and somehow wrestle the 100-pound assembly out of the combine. Then he'd have to get it back to his workshop, press the old bearing out, and press a new one in, assuming the parts store in town even had one for a 12-year-old Massey Harris. A horn blared from the road. It was Rich Peterson in his new Ford pickup. He pulled over and walked into the field, his work boots clean, his jeans unstained. "Looks like the old girl finally gave up the ghost," Rich said, not unkindly, but with an unmistakable air of vindication. "Cylinder bearing went," Sam said, his voice flat. He was too tired and too frustrated for another debate. "Tough break," Rich said, peering into the machine's innards. "You'll be down for days trying to find parts for this thing. Tell you what, I'm all done. I could come over with my 7700 in the morning and knock this out for you. Shouldn't take more than a couple of hours. I'll only charge you my standard custom rate." The offer hung in the air. It was practical. It was sensible. It would get the corn out of the field before the weather turned. But to Sam, it felt like surrender. It would mean admitting that Rich was right, that his old ways were foolish, that he couldn't make it on his own. It would mean paying his smug neighbor with money he had carefully saved, and the story would be all over the coffee shop by noon the next day. Hear about Sam Miller? Had to hire Rich Peterson to finish his harvest. That old Massey finally quit on him for good. Sam stood up, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "I appreciate the offer, Rich, but I'll handle it." Rich shrugged. "Suit yourself. Hope it doesn't rain." He walked back to his truck and drove off, leaving Sam alone with the setting sun and his broken machine. The next 3 days were a blur of greasy, back-breaking labor. He got the bearing housing out with a combination of pry bars, chains, and the hydraulic lift on his old Farmall M tractor. The parts store, miraculously, had the bearing set on a dusty shelf in the back. It cost him $43, a significant sum. He spent an entire night in his workshop, using his 20-ton press and a block of oak to carefully push the old, ruined bearing races out and the new, gleaming ones in. The air in the shop was thick with the smell of penetrating oil and the metallic tang of the cutting torch he'd used to heat the stubborn outer race. While he worked, the whispers in the community grew louder. At the feed mill, where he went to get a belt he'd noticed was frayed, Old Man Hemlock shook his head. "You're a stubborn man, Sam. Pride's a cold comfort when your crop is still in the field." Even Mary's faith seemed to waver. She brought him a thermos of coffee late the second night, her face etched with worry in the harsh glare of the single bulb hanging in the workshop. "David said he saw the Petersons looking at the Henderson place today," she said quietly. the one that just went up for sale. Sam didn't look up from the bearing he was packing with grease, his fingers working the thick, amber goo into the rollers. They can look all they want. Sam, she said, her voice gentle. Maybe Rich was right. Maybe we're falling behind. He finally stopped, looking at his wife, at the weariness in her eyes that mirrored his own. We're not behind, Mary. We're free. There's a difference. He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. On the third day, with a storm brewing on the western horizon, he finally wrestled the repaired assembly back into the combine. Every muscle in his back and arms screamed in protest. He tightened the last bolt as the first drops of rain began to fall, big, fat drops that splattered in the dust. He scrambled to get the shields back on, working with a frantic energy. He fired up the old Hercules engine. It caught, sputtered, and then settled into its familiar, throaty rumble. He engaged the separator, holding his breath. There was no squeal, no grind, just the clean, powerful whir of a well-running machine. He climbed into the seat, soaked to the skin, and finished the last 10 acres in a driving rain, the headlights of the old Massey cutting a weak yellow path through the downpour. When he finally shut it down by the grain bin that night, he was exhausted, filthy, and chilled to the bone. But he was finished, and he had done it himself. The years that followed seemed to prove Rich Peterson right, and Sam Miller a fool. The early 1970s brought an agricultural boom, the likes of which no one had ever seen. The Russian grain deal, coupled with a weak dollar, sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn that had been $1 a bushel was suddenly fetching $3. Soybeans went from $3 to $7, then $8, then $10. The government was telling farmers to plant fence row to fence row, and land prices soared. It was a gold rush, and the men with the newest, biggest equipment were the ones poised to cash in. Rich Peterson became the poster boy for the new prosperity. He bought the 160-acre Henderson place, financing it with land values that seemed to double overnight. He traded his John Deere 7700 for a new 8820, a monstrous machine with a price tag that made Sam's head spin. He bought a 4-wheel drive Steiger tractor and a 24-row planter. His farm was a constant buzz of activity, a showcase of modern, leveraged agriculture. At the diner, men spoke of him with a kind of awe. He was smart, aggressive, a real go-getter. He was the future. Sam, meanwhile, just kept doing what he'd always done. The high prices were a blessing, of course. For 3 straight years, from 73 to 75, he had profits he'd only dreamed of. But he didn't leverage them. He didn't buy more land. He didn't visit the John Deere dealership. The first year, he paid off the last of the mortgage on his original 200 acres. The paper-burning party was a quiet affair, just him and Mary at the kitchen table with a $10 bottle of sparkling wine. The feeling of owning his land, free and clear, was a profound relief that no new tractor could ever provide. The next year, he used the profits to re-roof the big hip-roof barn and put a new foundation under the corn crib. He bought Mary the new Kenmore stove and refrigerator she'd been wanting for a decade. He put the rest of the money into certificates of deposit at the Logan County Savings and Loan, earning a steady, if unspectacular, 5.5% interest. His neighbors thought he had lost his mind. "What's wrong with you, Sam?" His neighbor to the east, Frank Gable, asked him one day over the fence line. "Land is going for $2,000 an acre. In 5 years it'll be 4. You're sitting on a winning lottery ticket, and you won't cash it in." "The land I've got is keeping us fed, Frank," Sam replied calmly, tamping tobacco into his pipe. "How much land does a man need?" Frank just shook his head and walked away, muttering about old fools. Sam was seen as timid, un-American even. He lacked the vision, the guts to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. His old Massey 90, which he still ran every fall, became a symbol of his backwardness. While others were harvesting 8 or 12 rows at a time in air-conditioned comfort, Sam was still out there on his open station machine, taking 4 rows of corn, eating dust, a living relic of a bygone era. He kept it in perfect running order, of course. Each winter he'd tear into some part of it, rebuilding the transmission one year, replacing all the belts and chains the next. He painted it too, a fresh coat of Massey Harris red every few seasons. From a distance, it looked good, but up close you couldn't hide its age. The only person who seemed to understand was Mr. Abernathy, the elderly president of the bank. He was a holdover from the Depression era, a man with a healthy fear of debt and a deep skepticism of easy money. When Sam came in to buy another CD in the fall of '76, Abernathy called him into his office. "Sam, people are calling you a fool," the old banker said, peering over his spectacles. "They say you're missing the boat." "The boat seems to be headed for some choppy water, Mr. Abernathy," Sam said. Abernathy leaned back in his leather chair, which creaked in protest. "I think you're right. I see these loan applications every day. Young men like Rich Peterson, borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars, using land they bought yesterday at an inflated price as collateral to buy more land tomorrow at an even more inflated price. The interest rates are starting to climb. The government is printing money to pay for that war in Vietnam and all this great society spending. It can't last. When the music stops, there are going to be a lot of men without a chair to sit on." He leaned forward, his expression grim. "A man who owns his land and his equipment sleeps better at night, Sam. Don't you ever forget that." The conversation stuck with Sam. He felt less like a fool and more like a man building an ark while the sun was shining. The music began to fade in the fall of 1978. Grain prices, which had seemed invincible, started to soften. An embargo here, a bumper crop there, and suddenly the market was glutted. At the same time, the inflation Mr. Abernathy had warned about was raging. The price of fuel, fertilizer, and seed went up weekly, and to fight the inflation, the Federal Reserve began to ratchet up interest rates. The prime rate, the one the banks based their loans on, crept from 7% to 9%, then to 12%. One crisp evening in late October, Sam was in his machine shed, methodically working his way around the old Massey with a grease gun. He was getting it ready for winter storage, purging the old grease and pumping in new, a ritual he performed every year. The familiar, satisfying scent of lithium grease filled the cool air. He heard the deep, guttural roar of a massive diesel engine and walked to the big sliding door. On the road, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, was Rich Peterson. He was driving a brand-new, articulated Steiger Panther, a 4-wheel drive monster that was bigger than Sam's first house. It was pulling an enormous chisel plow that tore deep into the black soil of the old Henderson place, turning the earth over in huge, dark waves. The sheer scale and power of the machine were breathtaking. It was a symbol of everything Sam had rejected: power, size, speed, and an unimaginable mountain of debt. Rich sat high above the world in his sealed glass cab. The plow's guide markers extended like giant insect antennae. He didn't look over. He didn't wave. He just drove on, a king surveying his leveraged empire. Sam watched until the tractor was a silhouette against the darkening sky. He wiped his greasy hands on a red rag, a knot of deep unease tightening in his gut. The sky in the west was streaked with angry-looking clouds, the kind that often preceded a violent storm. It felt like a premonition, a sign that the good times were over. A hard rain was coming, not just for the fields of Logan County, but for the farmers who worked them. And Sam wondered if his small, sturdy ark would be enough to weather the flood. The storm that had been threatening on the horizon arrived not with rain, but with a malevolent, greenish-black fury. It was the summer of 1979, and a long, dry spell had left the corn leaves curled tight like cigars, the soybeans stunted and pale. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an unnatural silence. Then came the wind. It wasn't a gale. It was a physical blow, a solid wall of air that flattened the corn in great, chaotic swaths. It was followed by hail, first the size of peas, then marbles, then golf balls. Sam and Mary watched from the kitchen window as the ice stones hammered the tin roof of the machine shed, the sound a deafening, percussive roar. It shredded the crops, denting tractors and stripping paint from the side of the barn. In 20 minutes, it was over, leaving behind a landscape of bruised, battered ruin. The next day, the community was in a state of shock. Fields that had promised a break-even crop were now a total loss. Insurance would cover some of it, but not all, and it wouldn't cover the despair. The talk at the co-op was grim. Men who had borrowed heavily against the anticipated harvest were now facing a catastrophic shortfall. Sam found Rich Peterson standing by the side of the road, staring at his fields. The hail had been particularly vicious on his side of the county. The vast, beautiful fields that had been his pride were now a mangled wreck. The leaves were stripped from the soybean plants, leaving only bare skeletal stems. The corn stalks were broken and bent, the ears gashed open and ruined. Rich's face was ashen, his usual confident smirk replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. "Total loss," Rich said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He didn't seem to notice Sam's truck pull up. "The adjuster was just here. A total loss." "I'm sorry, Rich," Sam said, and he meant it. There was no victory in this, only shared misery. "We got hit hard, too, but not this bad." Rich finally turned, his eyes hollow. "What am I supposed to tell the bank? I've got a payment on that Steiger that's bigger than your property taxes for the whole year. Another one for the 8820. The operating loan. God, the operating loan." He ran a hand through his hair, his movements frantic. "The interest rate adjusted up again last month, 16%. Sam had no words of comfort. 16% was a death sentence on a loan of that size with no crop to pay for it. The real trouble for Rich, however, came a few weeks later. In a desperate attempt to salvage something, he tried to chop what was left of his corn for silage to sell to the cattle feedlot. He was out on his new Steiger, pulling a massive forage harvester, when a hydraulic line burst. Not a small leak, but a catastrophic failure. A high-pressure geyser of hot, red fluid erupted from under the tractor's articulation joint, coating the engine and undercarriage. The big Cummins diesel sputtered and died. The dealer sent out a field mechanic in a fully equipped service truck. The diagnosis was grim. The main hydraulic pump, a complex and hugely expensive component buried deep in the tractor's transmission housing, had failed. It had sent metal shavings throughout the entire hydraulic system, contaminating the steering, the brakes, and the remote circuits. The repair bill was over $8,000. The parts had to be special ordered from the factory in Fargo. The tractor would be down for at least 2 weeks, right when every farmer in the county was scrambling to get their fall tillage done. Sam saw the Steiger sitting idle in the field day after day. He saw the dealer's truck come and go. He heard the gossip at the parts store. Rich had to pay for the repair up front. He'd had a shouting match with the co-op manager over extending his line of credit for fuel. The cracks in his empire were no longer small fissures. They were gaping chasms, and everyone could see them. Sam, meanwhile, pulled his old Farmel M out of the shed. It was a 1951 model he'd bought for a few $100s years ago. It had no cab, no hydraulics to speak of, and less than 40 horsepower. But it started every time, and its simple 4-cylinder engine sipped gasoline instead of guzzling diesel. He hitched it up to his old 4-bottom plough and went to work. It was slow. Terribly slow. He could plough in a day what Rich's Steiger could do in an hour. But the fuel was paid for. The tractor was paid for. And when a seal on the water pump started to weep coolant, he fixed it himself in an evening with a $3 gasket and a tube of sealant. As he chugged along, the setting sun warming his back, he looked across the fence line at Rich's silent, crippled green monster. He felt a profound sense of pity, but also a quiet, solid affirmation of the path he had chosen. He wasn't just ploughing his field, he was turning over a truth that had been buried for a decade. The race didn't always go to the swift, or the battle to the strong. Sometimes it just went to the man who could stay in the race. The fall of 1980 arrived like a judgment. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union was in full effect, cratering commodity prices. At the same time, the Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, pushed the prime interest rate to an unthinkable 21.5%. For farmers carrying the massive debt of the 1970s expansion, it was like having the floor, the walls and the ceiling of their financial house collapse all at once. The Logan County Chronicle, which had once been filled with stories of record yields and land sales, now ran a new, grim column on its back pages. Foreclosure notices. Every week, another family name appeared in the stark, legalistic print. The Hendersons, the Gables, the Schmidts. These were not bad farmers. They were the very men who had been celebrated as visionaries just a few years before, the ones who had followed the advice to get big or get out. Now they were getting out, their dreams sold off piece by piece on the courthouse steps. A wave of fear and depression settled over the county. The coffee shop grew quiet. Men who used to brag about their new equipment now stared silently into their cups. The local machinery dealer, who had sold millions of dollars worth of iron on credit, went bankrupt himself. The bank, once a partner in prosperity, became an adversary. Mr. Abernathy had retired, replaced by a young, hard-faced man from a parent company in Des Moines who spoke of balance sheets and liquidation values, not of families and heritage. Sam and Mary weathered the storm. Their life hadn't changed much. They still lived frugally. With no debt payments, the money from Sam's modest crops was enough. He sold the corn and soybeans for painfully low prices, but it was still income, not a desperate payment against an ever-growing mountain of interest. The certificates of deposit he had so foolishly, in the eyes of his neighbors, bought during the boom years were now a lifeline, a cushion of security in a world of financial terror. He was able to pay his property taxes and buy his seed for the next year with cash. In 1981, that was a rare and remarkable thing. The end for Rich Peterson came on a cold, blustery Saturday in March of 1982. Sam saw the auction notice in the paper. It listed everything: the 480 acres of prime Logan County land, the Steiger Panther tractor, the John Deere 8820 combine, the 24-row planter, a whole life's ambition, catalogued and numbered for public sale. Sam went to the auction, not to bid, but to bear witness. He parked his old pickup down the road and walked up the long driveway to the Peterson farmstead. The yard was packed with farmers from 3 counties. They were like vultures, their faces grim, picking over the bones of a fallen pier. The equipment was lined up in neat, funereal rows, gleaming in the weak winter sun. It looked powerful and magnificent, but it was all tainted by failure. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, stood on a flatbed trailer, his voice a hypnotic, rhythmic chant that echoed across the yard. "All right, folks, here we go. The pride of the fleet, the Steiger Panther, barely broke in. Who'll give me 50,000 to start? 50,000? 50? 40? Who'll give me 40? $30,000 bill. Come on, folks. This is a $140,000 tractor." It sold for $28,000. A man from Iowa bought it, paying with a cashier's check. One by one, the symbols of Rich's empire were sold off for a fraction of what he owed on them. The 8820 Combine went for $35,000, the planter for $10,000. It was a bloodbath. Sam saw Rich standing near the barn, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of stone. His wife stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself as if to keep from flying apart. She was openly weeping. Rich wasn't just losing his machinery, he was losing his identity, his standing in the community, his future. He was being publicly stripped of everything he had worked for. Then the auctioneer moved on to the land. It was sold in 3 parcels, the 2 expansion parcels, the old Henderson place, and another 80 acres, sold first. They went cheap, bought by an out-of-state insurance company. Finally they came to the last parcel, the home, 160 acres, the original Peterson farm, the one Rich's grandfather had homesteaded. All right, the home quarter, 160 acres with a good house and buildings. Who'll start me at 1,000 an acre? Sam watched as Rich flinched, the words a physical blow. 1,000 an acre. Land he had valued at 4,000 just 3 years ago. The bidding was sluggish. No one wanted to be the one to take a neighbor's home place. But the man from the bank was there, a clipboard in his hand, and he would bid it up to a certain point to protect the bank's interest. Sam felt a sudden, powerful impulse. This was not about pride or vindication. This was about decency. He thought of his own farm, free and clear. He thought of the CDs sitting in the bank, earning interest. It was his ark, and it was big enough to carry one more passenger. He raised his hand. The auctioneer's eyes locked onto him. "I got a bid at 1,100. 1,100 from Sam Miller. Now 12. Who'll give me 12? A silence fell over the crowd. Every head turned to look at Sam, the quiet man with the old Massey Combine. He was bidding on Rich Peterson's farm. The man from the bank countered at 1,200. Sam came back at 13. The bidding went back and forth, Sam's voice calm and steady, until finally the banker shook his head. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his hammer falling with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. "For $1,400 an acre to Samuel Miller." Sam didn't look at the crowd. He walked over to where Rich was standing. The younger man wouldn't meet his eyes. He just stared at the ground, his jaw working. "I don't want your pity, Sam," he choked out. "It's not pity, Rich," Sam said, quietly. "It's a business proposition. I'll need a tenant to farm this ground for me. And I'll sell it back to you. Contract for deed. No bank involved. Just you and me. You pay me what you can, when you can, with a fair interest. You can buy it back for exactly what I paid for it today. This is your family's land. It should stay that way." Rich finally looked up, his eyes swimming with tears. He was speechless. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just nodded, a single, jerky motion, a gesture of profound, shattering gratitude. Sam nodded back, then turned and walked away, the buzz of the crowd fading behind him. He had never felt richer in his entire life. In the years that followed, the story of Sam Miller and Rich Peterson became a local legend, a cautionary tale told over coffee cups and across fence lines. The farm crisis slowly eased, and a new, leaner kind of agriculture emerged from the wreckage. The community's perspective had shifted profoundly. The men who had once mocked Sam's old Massey Combine now spoke of him with a quiet reverence. He was no longer a relic. He was a prophet. He was the man who had seen the storm coming and had built his house on a rock. Rich Peterson, humbled and stripped of his pride, became a different man. He farmed his old home place as Sam's tenant, using older, smaller equipment he bought for cash at farm sales. He worked harder than he ever had before, his hands now calloused and stained with grease. He and Sam became unlikely friends, bonded by the shared earth and a deep, unspoken respect. Every year, Rich made his payment on the land contract, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the harvest. He was slowly, painstakingly buying his heritage back. Sam's son, David, grew into a young man with his father's steady hands and thoughtful eyes. He went to the agricultural college for 2 years, but came back to the farm, drawn by the pull of the land. He had seen the boom and the bust, and he understood the lessons it had taught. One crisp October afternoon in 1989, Sam stood at the edge of a cornfield, the familiar rumble of the Massey Harris 90 Special filling the air. He was 70 years old now, his hair white and his face a road map of wrinkles carved by sun and worry. But his eyes were clear. He wasn't running the combine anymore. David was in the seat, his young hands expertly guiding the old machine, the dust and chaff swirling around him in the golden light. The Massey looked its age, but it ran like a top. David had rebuilt the Hercules engine the winter before, just as Sam had done 20 years earlier. It was a rite of passage. The combine was no longer just a piece of machinery. It was a part of their family's story, a rolling monument to survival. Rich Peterson pulled up in his dusty, 10-year-old pickup truck. He got out and walked over to stand with Sam. He looked older, weathered, but his eyes were clear. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a quiet competence. "Made the last payment, Sam," Rich said, handing him an envelope. "The farm's mine again, free and clear." Sam took the envelope, but didn't open it. He just nodded. "Never had a doubt, Rich." "I owe you more than the money," Rich said, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught me what it means to be a farmer. It's not about how many acres you own. It's about how many you can keep." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching David make another round. The old combine seemed to glow in the late afternoon sun, a beacon of faded red against the brown stalks and the vast blue sky. "You know," Rich said with a small smile, "for a museum piece, she still does a pretty good job." Sam smiled back, a deep, contented smile that reached his eyes. "She's got an understanding with the land," he said. Later that evening, as the moon rose over the harvested fields, Sam found David in the machine shed, checking the oil on the Massey. "She ran good today, Dad," David said, wiping his hands on a rag. "She always does if you treat her right," Sam replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, worn wrench. It was the one he'd used to tighten the cylinder bars 30 years ago. "Your grandfather gave this to me. He said a man who can't fix his own equipment is just a hired hand for the bank and the dealership." He was right. He placed the wrench in David's hand. It was warm and smooth from a lifetime of use. "We're not the biggest farm in the county, son," Sam said, his voice quiet but firm. "And we never will be. But we're still here. This land, this farm, it's ours. Not the bank's, not the government's. Ours. That's the only harvest that truly matters." David looked from the wrench to his father's face, and for the first time, he fully understood the weight of the choices Sam had made. He saw the years of ridicule, the lonely nights of repair, the quiet defiance against a world screaming for more, bigger, faster. It wasn't stubbornness. It was wisdom. It was love. He closed his hand around the wrench. the cool, solid steel, a tangible link to his past and a guide for his future. Outside, the autumn wind whispered through the dry corn stubble, carrying the scent of rich earth and the promise of another season, another generation, on the land they called their own.